The first thing Darren did when he landed on Varric 9 was nothing that he did not unpack. He did not check his tools. He walked to the nearest tree, pressed his palm flat against the bark, and stood there for a long moment, feeling the grain under his fingers. The tree was tall, probably 30 meters. The bark was dark reddish-brown, layered like old roof shingles, and when Darren pressed hard enough, he could feel the faint give of moisture beneath the surface. Live wood. Dense. Slow-growing, he guessed, which meant strong. That he stepped back, looked up through the canopy, and for the first time since the transport shuttle had dropped him in his single supply crate and left without a word, he allowed himself a small nod. Good, he thought. This will work. Half a kilometer away, in a small sensor post hidden among the rocks, a Sullivan bureaucrat named Rowe watched all of this through a monitoring lens and felt something close to confusion. Rowe had been assigned to Varric 9 3 days before the human arrived. His job was simple. Watch the human. File a failure report when a human gave up or died. Return home. He had already written the opening paragraph of that report. What he had not written was a section covering what to do if the human spent his entire first hour just touching trees. Darren spent the rest of the morning walking. He moved through the forest in wide, slow circles, always returning to the spot where his crate sat in the clearing. He tested the ground with his boot heel. He crouched near a narrow stream and watched the way the water moved. He looked at the hills to the north, and then he found a long shelf of dark rock jutting from the hillside about 80 meters away. He walked to it, ran his hand along the underside where the rock formed a clean horizontal overhang. Solid, about 4 meters of coverage. Facing south, which meant it caught the most light and blocked the north wind, he went back to the crate and started unpacking. Rowe typed quietly. Human is still alive. Activity unclear. Will continue observation. The crate held 40 pre-cut timber planks, a basic tool roll with a handsaw, hammer, chisel set, measuring cord, and folding knife, plus a water filter unit, a seed pack, and 3 weeks of dried rations. That was everything the Galactic Union had decided one human pioneer needed. Counselor Ben, who had approved the allocation, had described it as generous. Darren looked at the pile. Then he picked up 2 planks and walked to the rock shelf. He did not build walls first. That surprised Rowe. Instead, Darren spent the first afternoon solving a problem Rowe had not even identified as a problem. The ground beneath the overhang was slightly sloped. If you slept on it, you would roll. If rain ran down from the hillside, it would pool exactly where a floor would be. Darren spent 3 hours fixing that. He dug with the chisel and his hands, moved stones, packed earth, tested the level with a small pour of water, and adjusted until the ground was flat and slightly raised at the back so moisture would drain forward and away. Then he built the walls. 2 side walls, angled to meet the overhang above. A partial front wall with a door gap. He notched the timber joints with his chisel so they locked without nails. Rowe had never seen that technique. He made a note that by the time the first moon appeared, Darren had a sealed structure. Small and rough, but real. He packed dry grass between the inner and outer timber layers for insulation. His hands were bleeding in 2 places. He wrapped them without stopping. The chimney took another hour. He shaped river clay from the stream bank around a narrow timber frame, vented it up through a gap in the roof. He built a small fire inside, low and controlled, and watched the smoke. It went straight up. No backflow. He made a hot meal, sat against the back wall, and wrote in a small paper notebook by firelight. Outside, a gray storm rolled in from the north. The temperature dropped sharply. The wind found the walls and pushed, and the walls did not move. Rowe looked at his unfinished failure report for a long moment. Then he opened a new file and typed. The human built a thermally insulated, wind-resistant structure with drainage control in under 1 day, using only timber, hand tools, and natural materials. I do not know what I am supposed to report. I will continue watching. Inside the shelter, Darren closed his notebook and listened to the storm. He was not afraid of it. He had grown up in a place where the weather was never kind and never personal, and that place had taught him something useful. Stop being afraid of what you cannot control and spend that energy on what you can. He had prepared. He closed his eyes and slept. Spring came to Varric 9 the way it always did, without asking permission. The snow pulled back from the clearing in uneven patches, leaving dark, wet ground that steamed faintly in the mornings. The stream ran higher and louder. The big reddish trees pushed out small pale buds along their upper branches. Darren noticed all of it and wrote it down in his notebook, but he did not pause to admire any of it for long. He had work to do. Rowe, filing his third observation report of the season, noted that the human had survived the winter without requesting emergency supplies, medical support, or evacuation. He noted this carefully, then added a personal remark he would later remove before submitting. I am beginning to think the counselor made a serious miscalculation that Darren's first project of spring was not an expansion of the shelter. It was a furnace that he had found iron or during his winter walks, small dark deposits in the exposed rock of the streambed, the kind of thing most people would walk over and not recognize. Darren recognized it because he had grown up near a river that ran over the same kind of rock, and his grandfather had once shown him what to look for. He had not thought about his grandfather in a long time. He thought about him now, chipping carefully at the exposed seam with his chisel, and felt something quiet and warm in his chest. The furnace took 4 days. He shaped it from riverbed clay, thick-walled, with a narrow air channel at the base and a wider chimney opening at the top. He fired it slowly at first, letting the clay harden in stages so it would not crack. He made charcoal from green timber cut and covered to smolder rather than burn. On the 5th day, he loaded the furnace with charcoal and ore and used a bellows he had made from 2 flatboards and a stretched membrane from a small animal he had trapped humanely near the forest edge. The result was rough. The metal was impure and full of pockets, but it was metal. He cast a basic axe head using a clay mold he had carved himself, let it cool in the stream, and tested it against the nearest tree. The tree lost. Rowe's report that week was the longest he had ever filed. He included detailed notes on the furnace construction, the bellows design, and the clay mold technique. At the bottom, he added, I want to be clear for the record that none of this was in the approved resource package. The human created metalworking capacity from ambient planetary materials. I did not think this was possible without industrial support. I was wrong. Counselor Ben read the report, frowned, and sent back a single line. Are you sure you are observing the correct unit? Rowe confirmed that yes, he was observing the correct unit. With a proper axe, Darren's work sped up. He cut and split timber faster, shaped planks more cleanly, and began building the second structure he had been planning in his notebook all winter. Larger than the first, framed with heavier posts, designed to hold 6 people comfortably. He did not know exactly when other people would come. He just knew they eventually would, and he wanted them to have somewhere to sleep when they did. That he also built a greenhouse that he had been thinking about the seed pack all winter, rationing it carefully in his head. The seeds were standard food crops, not tailored for Verit 9. They would need protection to germinate in the thin soil and cold nights. Darren built a low-frame structure from split timber with a roof made from stretched and scraped animal membrane, thin enough to let light through, sealed at the edges with river clay. He filled planting beds with soil he had mixed himself, composted plant matter from the forest floor, mixed with fine stream sand, and wood ash from the forge. The first seedlings came up on a cold morning 9 days later, small green threads pushing through the dark soil. Darren crouched in front of them for a long time and said nothing. That it was around this time that Rowe crossed a line he had been carefully not crossing for several months. He walked to Darren's camp. He came around the edge of the clearing openly, because he did not want to startle anyone, and found Darren sharpening a blade outside the original shelter with a smooth, flat stone. Darren looked up, saw a 6-limbed, pale gray creature about chest height with large compound eyes, and did not flinch. You have been watching me since I landed, Darren said. It was not a question. Rowe stopped. Yes, I'm a union observer. I was assigned to document the outcome of your settlement. What outcome were you expecting? Rowe was quiet for a moment. Failure, he said, because lying felt wrong. Darren nodded slowly. Well, he said, you are welcome to keep watching. He went back to sharpening the blade. Rowe stood at the edge of the camp and watched the greenhouse, the forge, the new structure taking shape, the clean lines of the original shelter still standing solid after a full winter. He asked because he genuinely needed to know, You could have requested a supply drop at any point. Why did you not? Darren did not look up. Because once I know how to make something, he said, nobody can take that from me. A supply drop only lasts until the next drop does not come. Rose stood there for a long time after that. Then he went back to his post and started writing a very different kind of report. A full year had passed since Darren stepped off the transport shuttle with a crate of timber and a tool roll. Rowe had not filed the failure report. His supervisor had stopped asking about it. Counselor Ben had sent 2 messages in the last month asking for a status update and received 2 honest replies that he clearly had not enjoyed reading. The camp was not a camp anymore. The IT was not a settlement either. Not in the official union sense of the word. But it was something, and it was something that worked in the way that a good machine works, where every part feeds the next and nothing is wasted. The greenhouse compost went back into the planting beds. The ash from the forge went into the soil mix. The water was collected from the roof at 3 points, filtered through a gravel and charcoal bed Darren had built into the hillside, and then gravity-fed through a timber pipe system to the greenhouse, the forge, and the main shelter. At night, the forge heat was drawn through a channel beneath the floor of the sleeping structure and released slowly through the hours so the room stayed warm without an open flame. Rowe had started carrying his own notebook. He filled pages with sketches and measurements, not because he was required to document these things, but because he found that drawing them helped him understand them. He had studied planetary administration for 6 years and had never once been asked to think about how heat moves through a floor or how a water pipe must slope to maintain flow. He thought about both of these things now and found them surprisingly interesting. Darren was building the large structure's second wall when Rowe arrived one morning and noticed something new. The framing on the upper level was different from the lower. Heavier, braced at angles Rowe had not seen before. Stronger up top, Rowe observed. Snow load, Darren said without turning. Second winter will tell me if I got the angle right. But you are building for 2 winters from now. I am building for 20 winters from now, Darren said. And for whoever comes after that. Rowe looked at the second structure and truly understood for the first time that Darren was not trying to survive. He had already survived. What he was doing now was something else entirely. He was building the beginning of a place where survival would not need to be the primary concern, where the systems would handle the basics, and the people inside would be free to do other things. The dreck came on a still gray morning when Darren was outside splitting planks. There were 4 of them at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadow of the big reddish trees. They were low and broad, covered in dark layered scales that blended into the bark behind them, with 4 limbs and 2 shorter upper appendages that they held folded against their chests. Their eyes were wide and still. They did not move. Darren saw them. He did not stop working. He continued splitting planks, steady and unhurried, making no sudden movements. After about 20 minutes, he set down his axe, went inside, and came back out with a small portion of food, dried grain, and preserved fruit from the greenhouse, and placed it on a flat stone near the edge of the clearing. Then he went back to work. The dreck did not approach the food, but they did not leave either. Rowe, watching from a careful distance, wrote, first observe contact with native dreck species. No aggression on either side. Human response was to continue working and offer food. I want to note that this is not in any union contact protocol I have read. I also want to note that it appears to be working. Counselor Ben arrived on Varric 12 days later. He came in a small official transport with 2 staff members and the expression of a person who has been told something he does not believe and has come to correct the record in person. He stood at the edge of Darren's camp and looked at the greenhouse, the forge, the water system, the 2 structures, and the flat stone near the tree line, where something had clearly been eating the food left there regularly. He stood there for a long time. One of his staff members started to say something. Ben raised a hand, and the staff member stopped. Darren came around the side of the main structure, carrying a length of timber, and noticed the visitors. He nodded politely and kept walking. You are the human, Ben said. The settlement pioneer. Yes, Darren said. You built all of this. Yes. Ben's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly. The way a person's face moves when they are recalculating something they thought they already understood. I came to review the situation personally, he said carefully. "You are welcome to look around," Darren said. He set the timber down against the wall and picked up his chisel. "Mind the drainage channel on the east side. The ground is soft there." Ben looked at Roe, who had appeared quietly at the edge of the clearing. Roe met his supervisor's gaze and held it steadily, which was something he had never done before in his professional life. Ben looked back at the camp, at the greenhouse glowing faintly in the gray afternoon light, at the timber bridge Darren had built over the narrow stream, at the smoke rising straight and clean from the forge chimney that he said nothing for a long time. The eastern wall came down on a Tuesday. Darren did not know it was Tuesday because he had stopped tracking days of the week several months ago. He knew it was the 43rd day of the second season because he had written 42 entries in his notebook and was about to write the 43rd when the crack of splitting timber woke him before dawn. He came outside to find the eastern wall of the large structure on the ground. Not collapsed dramatically, just slowly given way at the base, the lower joints pulled apart by a combination of frost heave in the soil and water pressure from a drainage problem he had not caught in time. He stood and looked at it in the pale early light. Then he crouched, examined the broken joints, pressed his fingers into the wet soil at the base, and understood exactly what had happened. A secondary drainage channel he had assumed was flowing freely had been quietly blocked by sediment over the winter. Water had pooled. The ground had moved. The wall had followed. Roe arrived an hour later, notebook ready, and found Darren not in a state of panic, not cursing or sitting in defeat, but sitting cross-legged in front of the fallen wall writing notes. Carefully, methodically, like a person documenting an experiment that had produced unexpected results. "It fell," Rose said. "Yes," Darren agreed. "What are you writing?" "Why it fell," Darren said. "And what I'm going to do differently this time." Rose sat on a nearby stone and waited. He had learned by now that Darren's silences were not empty. They were working. The seedlings had also failed that week. An entire planting bed of grain shoots had yellowed and died, and Darren traced the cause to the soil mix. The forge runoff had been seeping into the ground slightly uphill of the greenhouse, altering the soil chemistry in a way that was slow and invisible until it suddenly was not. He had not caught it. He added that to his notes as well that he moved the forge 4 meters to the west, redesigned the drainage channel with a steeper grade and a stone filter at the inlet, and replanted the damaged bed with a corrected soil mix. Then he rebuilt the eastern wall from the base up, this time setting the lower posts on flat stones raised slightly above the soil line, so frost heave could not reach the joints that it took 8 days. His hands were rougher than they had been when he arrived. His shoulders had changed shape from a year of heavy work. He slept deeply every night and woke before the light every morning without needing a reason to dot on the 5th day of rebuilding. A small Drek came to the edge of the clearing alone. Darren had seen the Drek at the tree line most days now, always in small groups, always watching. He had continued leaving food on the flat stone, and the stone was always empty by morning. But this one was by itself, and it was smaller than the others, probably young, and it came further into the clearing than any of them had come before. T stopped about 3 meters from where Darren was working, fitting new base stones into the wall footing. It watched him with wide, still eyes. Darren slowed down. He did not stop, but he slowed his movements and made them deliberate. Pick up stone. Place stone. Press down. Check level. He moved like a person showing something to someone, not performing, just making the steps clear. The young Drek tilted its head. Then it reached down, picked up a flat stone from the ground near its feet, and placed it carefully next to the one Darren had just laid. Not randomly. At the same angle. In the same line, Darren looked at the stone. He looked at the Drek. He nodded once, the same small nod he had given the forest on the first day he arrived, and went back to work. The young Drek stayed for the rest of the morning. Inside his sensor post, Roe was supposed to be writing a report recommending Darren's removal and a full reset of the settlement program. Counselor Ben had sent the formal request 4 days ago. The report just needed Roe's signature and observations to support it. Roe looked at the report. He looked at his monitor, where Darren and the young Drek were side by side, fitting stones into a wall footing. He closed the unsigned report, opened a new file, and began writing something else entirely. It took him most of the afternoon. When he was done, He sent it to the Union Review Board directly, bypassing Ben's office entirely for the first time in his career. The document was titled, "A Formal Objection to the Removal of Settlement Unit D7 and a Request for Policy Review Regarding Human Resource Allocations." He pressed send before he could think too carefully about the consequences. Then he went to make tea and found that his hands were shaking slightly, and that he did not entirely mind. The message from the Drek arrived at the Galactic Union Central Office on a channel that had been listed as inactive for 60 years. Nobody knew the Drek had a communications device. As far as the Union's records were concerned, the Drek were a pre-contact species with no technology above basic tool use. The message was short and delivered in a language that took the Union's translation systems 4 hours to process. When it finally came through, the translated text read as follows. "Come and see what the soft-skinned one built. It is worth seeing." Counselor Ben was not told about the message until after it had already been forwarded to 3 separate departments. By that point, a small human follow-up team had already been approved and dispatched. Ben found out when the team was halfway to Varric 9, and there was nothing useful he could do about it. The team was led by a human engineer named Ren, who had spent 12 years designing resource systems for difficult environments. She had read Rose's reports carefully on the journey over and had formed a picture in her mind of what she expected to find. When the shuttle landed in the clearing and she stepped out and looked around, she understood immediately that her picture had been too small. Darren came around the side of the main structure and nodded at the new arrivals the same way he nodded at most things, calmly and without ceremony. Ren shook his hand and did not say anything for a moment because she was still looking at the water system. "The timber pipes," she finally said. "What is the grade?" 2 degrees on the main line, 1.5 on the secondary feeds, Darren said. "That is exactly right," she said, as though confirming something she had suspected. "I know," Darren said. "It took me 3 tries." The rest of the team spread out through the camp, while Darren walked Ren through each system in order. The water collection and filtration. The forge and its placement relative to the drainage. The greenhouse with its corrected soil beds, currently producing food in quantities that comfortably supplied 1 person and could supply 4 with minor expansion. The large structure with its angled roof bracing, its underfloor heating channel, and its insulated walls that held warmth through a Varric 9 night without any active fire. Rin took notes the entire time. She asked precise questions, and Darren gave precise answers. "The heating channel," she said. "That is passive thermal redistribution. We use that in advanced colony builds. I worked it out from how the rock shelf held heat," Darren said. "The stone stays warm hours after the sun moves off it. I just moved that idea inside." Rin wrote something in her notebook and underlined it twice. The follow-up team had brought real tools and materials. Metal fittings, proper insulation sheets, calibrated pipe sections, a portable fabrication unit. Darren accepted each item carefully, turned it in his hands, and then fitted it into his existing system, where it improved something without replacing what already worked. He did not tear anything down. He built forward. The Drek began appearing during the days when the team was working, first at the tree line, then closer, then among the structures themselves, moving quietly between the buildings with their folded upper limbs pressed to their chests and their wide eyes tracking every detail. Several of them spent an entire afternoon watching Rin calibrate the new water fittings. One of them, the young one who had helped Darren with the wall stones, stood at Darren's shoulder while he fitted a metal collar to a timber pipe joint and watched with the focused attention of a student at an exam. Ro had come out of his sensor post entirely by now. He spent his days in the camp alongside everyone else, and nobody questioned it, because everyone could see that he had more useful information about this place than anyone else present. Counselor Ben arrived with a formal union delegation on the 4th day. He walked through the camp with his 2 staff members, and this time he did not stand at the edge looking puzzled. This time he moved through the space with the careful expression of someone constructing a story. Rin watched him from across the greenhouse and said quietly to Darren, "He is going to call this a planned integration experiment." Darren was fitting a new greenhouse panel. He did not look up. "Let him. It matters," Rin said. "The plants do not care what he calls it," Darren said. "And neither do I." Roe was already at the back of Ben's delegation, documenting everything with quiet precision. Every statement Ben made in front of the Union observers, Roe noted alongside the actual timeline from his original files. He did not argue with Ben out loud. He simply recorded the truth with the patience of someone who knew the record would matter long after the conversation was over. In the evening, after the delegation had returned to their transport, the team sat outside around the low warmth of the forge, and someone asked Darren what he had been thinking on the first day, when the shuttle left and he was alone with a pile of timber. Darren thought about it for a moment. "I was thinking about the tree," he said, "about how long it had been growing. Slower than I would have liked. But it was exactly what I needed." He paused. "I figured if the planet had been working at this that long, the least I could do was pay attention." Nobody said anything for a while after that. The fire was low and warm. Above the clearing, the sky of Varric 9 was very clear and full of stars. The ceremony was short and administrative. A Union official read a formal statement reclassifying Varric 9 from provisional outpost to established colony. There were 2 signatures required, a witness statement and a small holographic seal placed on record. The whole thing took 11 minutes. Darren watched it from his workshop doorway, where he was in the middle of fitting a stone filter bed into a new section of water pipe, and when it was done, he went back to work. Wren, standing nearby, smiled at that point. 3 weeks later, Rose stood before a Union review board in a large formal chamber and gave his testimony. He had prepared for weeks. He had organized his files carefully, the original failure report he had never filed, the daily observations, the photographs and measurements, the record of Counselor Ben's visit, and his subsequent statements to the delegation that he spoke for 2 hours. He was careful and factual throughout, and the board asked many questions, and he answered all of them. Near the end, one of the board members asked Rowe what he believed the central lesson of the Varric 9 situation was in his professional judgment. Rowe had expected this question. He had written and rewritten his answer many times, he said. The Union made an error in assigning minimum resources to the human pioneer, but the error was not cruelty. Cruelty would have been something the Union could have simply stopped doing. The actual error was underestimation, and that is harder to correct because it lives in assumptions that feel reasonable from the inside. The board assumed a human with timber would fail because the board measured what timber could do in human hands against what they believed human hands were capable of. They had the timber right. They had the hands wrong. The board was quiet for a moment after that. Then the chair asked what policy change Rowe would recommend for future human settlement allocations. Rowe opened his notes, looked at the page he had prepared, and then closed the notes and spoke without them. "Give them what they ask for," he said. "Not because humans are the most advanced species in the Union. Not because they're the strongest or the fastest or the most technologically capable. But because when a human looks at a resource, they do not see only what it is. They see what it could become if treated correctly. That is not a warning. It is a resource, and the Union should stop being afraid of it." Counselor Ben was quietly reassigned to a desk position in a planetary records division 2 weeks after the board concluded. The reassignment notice described it as a lateral transfer in consideration of upcoming organizational priorities. Nobody in the room where it was discussed said anything other than that. On Varric 9, Darren had moved on to the next project. IT had come to him during a dry stretch of the second summer, when the stream ran lower than usual, and he had spent 3 days thinking about what would happen if it ran lower still. The result was a passive water collection and distribution system built from shaped timber, fitted river stone, and gravity. No pumps, no power source, no moving parts except water. It collected moisture from the air during the cold nights through a series of angled surfaces, channeled it into a stone cistern, and fed it from there to a network of distribution points. He calculated that it could supply clean water to a settlement of 200 people. Indefinitely, he taught the design to 3 Drek engineers over the course of a month. They were precise students who asked excellent questions and twice found improvements Darren had not considered. He added their improvements to his notebook and acknowledged them clearly by name in his design notes. The Drek settlement and Darren's settlement had been growing toward each other for some time now, and nobody had formally decided this was happening. It had simply occurred the way good things sometimes occur, through accumulated small decisions made by people who were paying attention, that on a gray afternoon near the end of the second autumn, Roe came to find Darren sitting outside the original shelter, the first structure Darren had ever built on Varric 9. It was rough and small compared to everything around it. The clay chimney had been repaired twice. The timber walls had darkened with weather to a deep reddish black. The door gap still had no door, just a hanging panel of layer material that kept the wind out and could be pushed aside easily. It looked exactly like what it was, a thing built fast by a person who had needed it urgently and had built it well despite that. Rose sat beside Darren, and they were quiet for a while, which had become comfortable between them in the way that silence becomes comfortable between people who have watched the same things for long enough. "You should put a door on that," Rose said eventually. "I thought about it," Darren said. "What stopped you?" Darren looked at the old shelter for a moment. "The next person who lands here with nothing is going to be scared," he said. "I want them to be able to see inside from a distance. I want them to see that someone slept in there and stayed warm and was fine." Roe looked at the shelter. "You want it to look like it can be done. I want it to be proof that it can be done," Darren said. "There is a difference." Roe thought about that. He thought about the failure report he had never filed, and the testimony he had given, and a small note he had written on his first night of observation. The human is still alive, activity unclear. He thought about how wrong he had been, not about Darren specifically, but about what he had expected a person to be. Above the door of the original shelter, Darren had fixed a small piece of timber with words carved into it in neat plain letters. Below those, the same message had been carved in Drek's script by the young Drek, who had grown from a curious observer into something that Darren, in his notebook, referred to simply as a colleague. The sign said, "Start here." Not a monument, not a memorial, just an instruction, the most useful kind.